The Snowflake Makers, read and written by Chloe Huntington. It was winter season. There was ice but no snow. Where was the snow? In that time snow hadn't been created yet. Yes, snow was created. Snow was made by a man by the name of Evander Lauer. He wondered why winter was so plain. Leaves turned orange and bronze in autumn. Flowers would grow and bloom in the spring. But nothing ever happened in the winter. Yes, it got colder. A lake or two would freeze up and animals would go into hibernation. But winter didn't have much to offer. What could Evander Lauer create that would make winter special? Evander went to his daughter Eris's room. As he opened the door, Eris's dark eyes gave him a blank stare. "What are you doing in my room, Dad?" Eris spat. Her jet-black hair sparkled in the light reflecting from her window. "I have an idea," Evander spoke with a smile. "You always have ideas, and they've always failed. Get out!" Eris shouted as she slammed the bedroom door. Evander waited at her door for a few minutes before letting out a small sigh and leaving the hall. He headed towards his study. It wasn't a considerably large room, but it was perfect for him. He sat down at the wooden desk and began to scribble his latest plan on parchment. A six-sided shape had formed on Evander's page. It was hexagonal, but it had arms coming from it with lines and a swirling design on it. Evander had designed his perfect snowflake. It was late, but he didn't mind. He had to show his daughter his creation. He almost skipped to his daughter's door and knocked on it lightly. "Eris, are you awake?" Evander said in a whispered tone. He heard some rustling coming from his daughter's room, and then he watched as the door in front of him swung open. "Dad," Eris said. "What's up?" Her makeup made her look tired as she gave him a neutral look. "I have a new drawing. Would you like to see it?" Evander's eyes looked sad. He had not seen his teenage daughter for a few hours, and he felt miserable. Eris looked at the parchment in his father's hand, and she turned her head to the left. "Come in," she directed. Evander slowly crept into her room and headed for her black desk. Eris looked at it for a moment. "What is it meant to be, Dad?" she questioned. Evander looked at her. "It's called a snowflake." They both stared at the page for a second. "A snowflake? What does it do?" Eris wondered. Evander stopped to think for a moment. "It is meant to fall from the sky, stick on the ground, and bring joy to adults and children." He smiled for a moment before he watched his daughter turn to him. "How do we make it, Dad?" Eris smiled faintly. "You really want to?" Evander asked. He watched Eris nod. "Yes, Dad. We haven't made anything together since Mum died." She grabbed the parchment drawing from her desk and proceeded to leave her small bedroom. "Come on, Dad," Eris said as she walked into her father's study. "Let's make our snowflake." She smiled at her dad. Evander grated ice until it was in oddly shaped pieces. They began to fill the parchment snowflake design with ice pieces until the snowflake was formed. Eris and Evander looked at each other and smiled. "How are we able to make all these pieces stay together?" Eris questioned. Evander put his rubber glove-covered hand on his chin. "Let's leave it to melt a little, and then put it into the freezer for a few hours so it all sticks together," he suggested. Eris picked up the ice sculpture and headed towards the freezer. Her father opened it for her and she placed it in. She shut the lid and turned to Evander. "I'm sorry, Dad. Sorry I haven't been around here much. Mum's passing has really had an effect on me." Eris's eyes were full of sadness and sorrow. Evander looked at his daughter and could see her sadness. "Eris, it's okay. I know you miss Mum." His words sounded sincere as he took Eris into a small hug. Evander had slept in his study. His eyelids felt heavy as he tried so hard to open them. Eventually his body left his chair and headed towards the freezer. He opened it to reveal a perfectly symmetrical shape. His snowflake had worked. "Eris, Eris," Evander shouted with desperation. He heard footsteps from his teenage daughter as she raced to his study. Eris huffed. "Dad, what's wrong?" Evander looked at her and suddenly smiled. "It worked. Our snowflake worked. Both of them began to dance, a dance to celebrate Evander's first successful invention. Dad, you did it, Eris said, her face beaming with a smile. How are you going to manufacture this? And what's going to happen when it melts? Eris questioned. Evander thought to himself for a small moment. Manufacturing? We can make it tiny, very tiny, tiny enough for a magnifying glass. Eris looked at him. And what about melting, Dad? Because it will melt. Evander did not need to think about his answer. He knew what he was going to say. Just let it melt. If the temperature is cold enough, it'll turn into snow. And when it gets warm, obviously it will melt. Evander then took his snowflake into the hall and put on his coat. You coming? He asked. Eris ran and put on her black coat to match her outfit and hair colour. Where are we going? Eris asked. I'm going to the council. We need to get workers to manufacture tiny snowflakes. Evander and Eris left their house and made their way to the councillor's office. Excuse me, the councillor spoke. Evander and Eris were sat opposite the councillor. The snowflake was staring at him on his desk. We need workers to make snowflakes. Evander looked at him. How many? The councillor asked. About 20 or so, Eris interrupted. The councillor and Evander looked at her for a small moment before Evander turned back to meet the councillor's eyes. Yeah, like she said, at least 20, maybe more. Depends on how long it takes to make them. Evander folded his arms. Okay, well, I can't just give you workers. You'll need volunteers, the councillor suggested. Evander nodded. Volunteers, okay. He then left the councillor's office with Eris tailing behind him. Dad, what are you thinking? She questioned. I'm going to turn the house into a mini snowflake factory and hire some workers who need jobs, he explained as he rushed back with Eris to his home. Evander and Eris turned their house into a working snowflake making factory. They had hired 3 people to help them create their miniature sculptures. The process was long because of the snowflake size, but before the day was over, they had made 45 mini snowflakes. Evander was pleased about his creation. However, he had a small problem. How was he going to let it snow? We need planes. Evander raised his voice to his daughter. Why do we need planes for? Eris questioned. We need planes so we can chuck buckets of snowflakes out so it looks like it's raining. Eris, we need the wow factor. We need winter to be a memorable season, Evander told her. He headed into a room that used to be his kitchen and headed towards a red-haired man. Ned, we need to borrow your plane, Evander told him. Ned gave Evander a dirty gaze, but silently chucked him the keys. I would not give it to you if you weren't paying my bills, Ned told him. The trolley full of snowflakes was loaded onto the plane. When I press the button, tip one basket and release the snowflakes, Evander told Eris. Without a word, she nodded and headed into the back of the plane, Evander up front. He turned on the ignition and prepared himself for flight. The cool winter air was thin. The sky was cloudy and white. Evander looked down at the world beneath him and pressed his thumb onto the button. Now! Evander shouted. Eris tipped the first basket out and released the snowflakes into the world. The flakes flurried downwards as Evander watched people leave their homes to watch the strange flakes flutter past them. The people on the ground were in awe of the cold, shimmering flakes that were floating around them. What is this? One lady asked. Smiles were suddenly seen on their faces. The flakes formed on the ground beneath them into a crunchy layer of white snow. The people did not know how to react. This was a new sight for them. A young boy reached down to pick up the snow, and it formed into a small ball. He threw it at his friend, who then picked up a snowball and threw it back. They finally had something to remember winter by. Since then, Evander would come out every winter and release snowflakes into the world. His daughter, Eris, took over the snowflake business when her father died, and she passed the snowflake trade down to her 2 sons. My name is Cecile Morgan, and I'm the great-granddaughter of Evander Lauer. I currently own the snowflake business, and every year I go out in my plane and drop snowflakes into the world to have people remember winter as being full of happiness, friendship, and laughter.